It is the night of October 8, 1871. The wind blows hard from the southwest, dry, relentless, the kind that hasn't let up for weeks. The city of Chicago has had almost no rain all summer. Its streets are paved with wood, its sidewalks are wood, its houses, its storefronts, its stables, its fences, nearly everything is wood. And somewhere on the southwest side of the city, something ignites inside a barn on Pullman Street. What happens next will burn for 36 hours straight. Now, here's something worth knowing before we go any further. Because this story begins with a myth. The legend about a cow kicking over a lantern in Catherine O'Leary's barn. That story was invented by a reporter named Michael Ahern, who admitted decades later that he had fabricated the detail to make his article more colorful. The O'Leary family was eventually exonerated. To this day, the true cause of the Great Chicago Fire has never been definitively established. What investigators found was that the fire started in or near the O'Leary barn, but what sparked it remains officially unknown. That uncertainty, though, barely matters when you see what the fire actually did. It burned for 36 consecutive hours. It moved northeast, driven by that relentless southwest wind, devouring everything in its path. By the time it died out on the evening of October 10th, stopped partly by a shift in the wind and partly by rain, the destruction was almost incomprehensible. Thousands of buildings gone, an estimated 300 people dead, roughly $200 million in damages at 1871 values. A strip of devastation approximately 4 miles long and nearly 1 mile wide had cut straight through the heart of the city, including its entire downtown business district. 1/3 of Chicago's 324,000 residents were left without a home. Standing in that rubble, looking at the smoldering skeleton of what had been one of the fastest-growing cities in North America, a reasonable person might have concluded, "This is over." They would have been spectacularly wrong. Here is what most people don't realize about Chicago in October 1871, and this is the part that changes everything. The fire was catastrophic, yes, but it was not total. The fire destroyed the business district, but it left the Union stockyards and the new meatpacking plants on the south side completely untouched. Most of the wharfs, lumberyards, and mills along the Chicago River survived. 2/3 of the grain elevators survived. And crucially, most of the railroad tracks were not damaged. Think carefully about what that means. The nervous system of the American economy, rails, stockyards, grain, lumber, steel, was still intact. Chicago had not been gutted. It had been scorched on the surface, but its bones were solid. The city had not lost its geography, its waterways, its position at the crossroads of the nation's rail network. It had lost buildings. Buildings can be rebuilt. And so Chicago did something remarkable. It rebuilt, immediately, aggressively, with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. Within weeks of the fire, construction crews were already at work. Within months, new buildings were rising from the ash. Within a decade, the city's population had grown from 324,000 to more than 500,000. By 1890, less than 20 years after the disaster, Chicago had surpassed 1 million residents, making it the second largest city in the United States, behind only New York. By 1893, the population had reached an estimated 1.5 million people. That's not recovery. That's transformation. No city in the Western world had ever grown that fast. Not London after its Great Fire, not any European capital during the Industrial Revolution. Chicago's rate of expansion in the 2 decades following 1871 was, by most historical accounts, unprecedented in the modern world. But growth like that doesn't happen through wishful thinking. It doesn't come from civic pride alone. It comes from capital, from industry, from infrastructure, and from the men who understood how to turn both into power. Before the fire, Chicago had already positioned itself as the most important commercial node in the American interior. It was the central hub of the national railroad system, which had reached the Pacific coast in 1869. It was the processing center for raw materials flowing eastward from the frontier: timber, grain, livestock. In 1865, a consortium of 9 railroad companies had jointly created the Union stockyards on the south side, which rapidly turned Chicago into the meatpacking capital of the continent. The infrastructure was already there. The fire accelerated everything. In 1884, just 13 years after the disaster, A Chicago architectural firm completed the home insurance building, a 10-story structure supported by an internal steel cage frame rather than thick masonry walls. It was the world's first true skyscraper. Chicago was literally building upward because it had run out of horizontal space, surrounded on one side by Lake Michigan and on the others by rail lines and industrial zones. The skyline emerging from those ashes was not a reconstruction of what had been lost. It was something the world had never seen before. By 1890, 41% of Chicago's population consisted of foreign-born immigrants, arriving primarily from Germany, Ireland, Scandinavia, and Great Britain, with growing numbers from Poland, Italy, and Bohemia. They came because there was work in the stockyards, work in the rail yards, work in the steel mills, the lumber operations, the garment factories. They arrived by the thousands every month, packed into neighborhoods on the west and south sides, rebuilding the city with their hands, while a much smaller group of men collected the profits from above. And that is the tension at the very center of this story, a tension we will return to throughout every chapter of this documentary. Because here is the truth about Chicago in the Gilded Age. It was not one city. It was two cities sharing the same smoke-darkened sky. On one side, there were the skyscrapers, the grand hotels, the department stores with their polished marble floors, the concert halls and private clubs where the language of power was spoken quietly over imported wine. On the other side, just a few miles away, there were the stockyard floors where immigrant workers stood ankle-deep in blood for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. There were the overcrowded tenements of the West Side, where families of 5 shared a single room without running water or adequate heat. Both of these cities were real. Both of them were Chicago. After the fire, the men who had profited most from Chicago's pre-war boom moved southward, away from the industrial North Side and the stench of the Chicago River. They chose a quiet, wide thoroughfare running north to south on the near South Side, close enough to the commercial center to stay connected to business, far enough from the factories to breathe cleaner air and sleep in peace. The lots were generous. The proximity to Lake Michigan offered a breeze in summer. It was, by any measure, the finest residential address the city had to offer. They called it Prairie Avenue. By 1877, a remarkable concentration of wealth had gathered in a span of just 4 city blocks along that street. Chicago's 3 wealthiest residents, the retail magnate Marshall Field, the railroad sleeping car innovator George Pullman, and the meatpacking king Philip Armour, all lived within that same short stretch. Around them, other fortunes clustered. The farm machinery executive John Glessner, the piano manufacturer William Wallace Kimball, the Union Stockyards founder John Sherman. Architects of national reputation, including Henry Hobson Richardson and Solon Spencer Beeman, were commissioned to design homes that would reflect the scale of the fortunes being made. The rest of the city, and soon the rest of the country, came to know Prairie Avenue by another name, Millionaires Row, and during the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, when Chicago welcomed an estimated 5 million visitors from around the world to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, Prairie Avenue was actually recommended as a tourist attraction. Visitors who had come to see the White City and the first Ferris wheel were also directed south to walk past the mansions of the men who had built the real city. That is where our story lives. In those mansions, in those boardrooms, in those factory floors, and in the gap between them, 5 families, 5 fortunes. 5 different versions of what it meant to be powerful in America at the end of the 19th century. In the chapters ahead, we will walk through every one of those doors, and we will not look away from what we find on either side. Before Prairie Avenue became the most famous address in Chicago, it was a trail. That's not a metaphor. The stretch of land that would one day host some of the grandest private residences in the American Midwest began its existence as a Native American path, a route linking Fort Dearborn in Chicago to Fort Wayne in Indiana, cutting through the open prairie that gave the street its name. For decades, it was nothing more than a dirt track used by horses, traders, and the occasional traveler crossing the flat, wind-swept terrain of the South Side. Then, the city grew. Then, the fire came. And then, on this modest strip of land, the wealthiest men in Chicago began to build. The story of Prairie Avenue is inseparable from the story of the Great Fire. When the flames of October 1871 consumed the north side and the city's central business district, they stopped short of the south side. Prairie Avenue and the neighborhoods surrounding it were untouched. And as the wealthy residents of the burned zones assessed the ruins and decided where to rebuild their lives, many of them looked south. The logic was simple and practical. The area was close enough to downtown to remain connected to commerce. A 15-minute carriage ride would bring you to your office, but it sat on the other side of the Chicago River, which meant no bridge crossings, no flooding risk, and a reliable buffer from the noise and stench of the industrial waterfront. The grain elevator owner Daniel Thompson was actually the first to build a major mansion in the area, completing a large home at 1936 South Prairie Avenue in 1870 before the fire. But it was the disaster that truly accelerated what came next. Displaced wealthy residents arrived on the south side with capital, ambition, and a desire to build something permanent this time, something that would not burn. What they built was extraordinary. By 1877, a concentration of wealth had settled on Prairie Avenue that had no real equivalent anywhere west of New York City. In that single year, Chicago's three richest men, retail magnate Marshall Field, railroad sleeping car innovator George Pullman, and meatpacking king Philip Armour, all lived within a 4-block stretch of the same street. Around them, the fortunes kept clustering. The piano and organ manufacturer William Wallace Kimball took up residence at 1801 South Prairie. The Union Stockyards founder John Sherman was nearby. Farm machinery executive John Jacob Glessner and his wife Frances built their home at 1800 South Prairie. The wagon maker Peter Studebaker was on the avenue. So was the meatpacking competitor Gustavus Swift. At the peak of the neighborhood's prosperity, in the 1880s and into the 1890s, nearly 90 mansions stood along that 6-block corridor between 16th and 22nd Streets. At one point during that decade, 16 of the 60 members of the Commercial Club of Chicago, the most powerful business organization in the city, lived on Prairie Avenue or its immediate surroundings. It was not merely a residential street, it was, in every practical sense, the boardroom of Chicago. Now, imagine walking down Prairie Avenue on a Sunday morning in 1886. The street itself is wide and tree-lined, far removed from the muddy chaos of the stockyard districts to the southwest or the crowded tenements of the west side. The air is noticeably cleaner here, carrying the faint salt breeze off Lake Michigan rather than the thick smoke of the factory chimneys visible on the horizon. The sidewalks are stone, not the wooden planks still common in working-class neighborhoods. Along the avenue, set back from the street behind iron gates and manicured grounds, the mansions rise one after another, each one a monument in stone, brick, and ambition. The architectural variety alone was remarkable. At 1905, South Prairie, Marshall Field's mansion was designed by the New York architect Richard Morris Hunt, the same man who would later design the base of the Statue of Liberty and the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Field's home was completed between 1873 and 1876 at a cost that reportedly exceeded $2 million, an extraordinary figure for the era. It was among the very first homes in Chicago to install electric lighting, a technology so new that most of the city still used gas lamps. The house served simultaneously as a private home and as a statement. This is what retail commerce can produce. Next door at 1919 South Prairie, Field would eventually purchase a second home for his son, Marshall Field Jr., built in 1884. Father and son, literally side by side on the most prestigious street in the Midwest. George Pullman built his mansion at 1729 South Prairie Avenue, completing it in 1876. The structure was designed in the French Second Empire style, the same architectural vocabulary then fashionable among the European aristocracy, and was described by contemporaries as reminiscent in its grandeur and ambition of the Paris Opera House. Heavy stone, elaborate cornices, formal reception rooms designed to receive guests in a manner appropriate to a man of international stature. Philip Armour settled at 2115 South Prairie in a Second Empire-style home that had originally been built in 1871 for a lumber merchant. When Armour moved in, the house became something else entirely, the residence of the man who was transforming not just Chicago, but the entire American food supply. And at 1800 South Prairie, between 1885 and 1887, the farm machinery executive John Glessner commissioned the architect Henry Hobson Richardson to build what would become the most architecturally significant home on the entire street. Richardson's Glessner House was a deliberate departure from the ornate Victorian excess of its neighbors, a massive structure of rusticated granite, fortress-like and severe on the exterior, with a Romanesque arch over the entrance that made some Prairie Avenue residents initially mistake it for a church or a jail. Inside, however, it was warm, intimate, and filled with natural light. The house was so original in its conception that it became an inspiration to the next generation of American architects, including Louis Sullivan and a young draftsman named Frank Lloyd Wright, who would later transform the entire landscape of domestic architecture in the United States. But Prairie Avenue was not only about architecture, it was about social power. And that power was performed constantly, visibly, and with considerable extravagance. The social life of Prairie Avenue operated according to a precise and well-understood hierarchy. The families of the avenue worshipped together at the Second Presbyterian Church, a Chicago landmark just a few blocks away, whose stained glass windows were among the finest in the city. They socialized through the Commercial Club, the Union League Club, and through a dense network of private dinners, calling cards, and formal visits that governed who was considered acceptable company and who was not, and the parties. The parties on Prairie Avenue were events that the entire city talked about for weeks. On January 1, 1886, Marshall Field and his family hosted what became known as the Mikado Ball, a celebration of his son's 18th birthday, held in the mansion at 1905 South Prairie. The house was decorated to resemble a Japanese village, referencing the Gilbert and Sullivan opera, then sweeping fashionable society on both sides of the Atlantic. Some guests arrived in costume. The party was a catered affair, and the artist James McNeill Whistler, of the famous painting known as Whistler's Mother, designed the party favors. Contemporary accounts estimated the cost of the event at $75,000. In 1886, money, that was a staggering sum. For context, it was roughly equivalent to what many Prairie Avenue laborers would earn over a lifetime. That contrast, between the lavishness inside those iron gates and the hardship just beyond them, was present on Prairie Avenue every single day. The mansions were built, after all, by the same men whose companies employed thousands of workers in conditions that bear almost no resemblance to the world their employers inhabited. The same Pullman who hosted grand receptions in his French Second Empire mansion was the man who, in 1894, would cut his workers' wages by as much as half without reducing their rents in the company town he controlled on the South Side, a decision that would trigger one of the most consequential labor strikes in American history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1886, at the height of Prairie Avenue's golden era, none of that had happened yet. The guidebooks of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, which drew an estimated 27.5 million visitors to Chicago from around the world, actually listed Prairie Avenue as a recommended tourist attraction. Visitors who had come to see the White City and the first Ferris wheel were encouraged to ride south and take a carriage past the mansions of Millionaires Row. The street had become, in the public imagination, a symbol of what the new American industrial order could produce at its apex, a vision of private wealth so concentrated and so displayed that it functioned almost like a public spectacle. And yet, even as those guidebooks were being printed, the first signs of the street's eventual decline were already appearing. In 1885, Potter Palmer's wife, Bertha Palmer, had built their permanent family residence on the newly developed Lakeshore Drive along the northern lakefront, a move that signaled a shift in where Chicago's elite would ultimately choose to plant their flags. The Gold Coast, not Prairie Avenue, was where the next chapter would be written. But before we follow that story northward, we need to go inside those mansions. We need to understand in detail who these men were, how they built their fortunes, and what life actually looked like behind those stone facades and iron gates, starting with the man who redefined what it meant to go shopping in America. He arrived in Chicago with almost nothing. That is not a figure of speech. In 1856, a 22-year-old man named Marshall Field stepped off a train in a city he had never seen before, carrying the experience of 5 years spent working as a dry goods clerk in a small store in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and very little else. He had grown up on a farm in Conway, Massachusetts, the son of a Puritan family whose roots in New England stretched back to 1629. There was nothing in his background that suggested he would become the wealthiest man in Chicago, or that his name would one day be synonymous with American retail itself. But Marshall Field had something harder to measure than capital. He had an instinct for what people wanted before they knew they wanted it. And in the explosive commercial environment of post-fire Chicago, that instinct would prove to be worth more than any inheritance. Within 6 years of his arrival, Field had risen from clerk to junior partner at the firm where he worked. By 1865, he had joined forces with the established Chicago retailer Bertha Palmer and a meticulous accountant named Levi Leiter to form a new dry goods company. The firm cycled through several names as partners came and went, but by 1881, Field had bought out Leiter entirely, and the store took the name it would carry into history, Marshall Field and Company. Now, what made Marshall Field genuinely revolutionary had nothing to do with the size of his building or the elegance of his merchandise, though both were considerable. What set Field apart was something far more fundamental. He completely reimagined the relationship between a merchant and a customer. In the retail world of the mid-19th century, the reigning philosophy was summed up in the Latin phrase caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Prices were negotiated, not fixed. Returns were essentially unheard of. Customers were expected to examine merchandise carefully before purchasing, because once money changed hands, that transaction was final. Shopping, in other words, was a transaction conducted on the merchant's terms. Field reversed every one of those assumptions. His store offered fixed prices, the same for every customer, without negotiation or haggling. He introduced an unconditional return policy. If a customer was dissatisfied with a purchase, for any reason, she could bring it back. He imported merchandise from Europe to offer his customers goods they could not find elsewhere in the American Midwest. He instructed his sales staff never to pressure uninterested customers, a radical departure from the aggressive salesmanship typical of the era. The phrase most often associated with Field, "Give the lady what she wants," was not merely a motto. It described an entirely new commercial philosophy in which the customer, not the merchant, held the power. That shift was calculated with great precision. Field's primary target was the emerging class of urban women with time and money, the wives and daughters of Chicago's expanding middle and upper classes, who were increasingly making household purchasing decisions but had historically been poorly served by retail environments designed around male commercial culture. Field built his store for them. He made it safe, comfortable, elegantly appointed, and staffed with people trained to assist rather than press. He understood, before almost anyone else in American commerce, that a woman who felt genuinely welcome in a store would return, and would bring others with her. The Great Fire of 1871 nearly destroyed everything Field had built. The store at State and Washington burned to the ground. But within weeks, an extraordinary logistical achievement, Field and his team had recovered enough salvaged merchandise to reopen operations, first in a temporary location at a former streetcar barn, then in a rebuilt structure by 1872. The speed of that recovery became part of the Field legend in Chicago. He was the first major merchant to reopen after the fire, and that fact earned him a loyalty from the city that endured for decades. By 1881, the year he finally assumed sole control and renamed the company after himself, Field was operating two distinct and enormously profitable enterprises under one name. The retail store on State Street, opulent, theatrical, designed to dazzle, catered to the ladies of Chicago's growing consumer class. The wholesale operation, housed from 1887 onward in a magnificent 7-story Romanesque warehouse on Franklin Street, designed by the architect Henry Hobson Richardson, supplied general store owners from across the central and western United States with merchandise in bulk. General store owners from Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri would travel to Chicago to walk the floors of the wholesale building, 500,000 square feet of merchandise, accompanied by Field's representatives who took them to lunch and dinner and made the entire transaction feel less like commerce and more like hospitality. The wholesale division, run by a talent named John G. Shedd, whom Field himself once called the greatest merchant in the United States, generated 6 times the revenue of the retail store. It was the wholesale profits, more than anything else, that made Marshall Field the richest man in Chicago. By 1905, the year before his death, Field's personal fortune was estimated at $125 million, roughly equivalent to more than $3 billion in today's values. That fortune supported a life of considerable material refinement. Though by the standards of Prairie Avenue's most theatrical residents, Field was known for personal restraint. His mansion at 1905 South Prairie Avenue, designed by the celebrated New York architect Richard Morris Hunt, and completed between 1873 and 1876 at a reported cost exceeding $2 million, was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. It was among the first private homes in Chicago to install electric lighting. It contained 25 rooms, and yet people who knew Field personally described him as a workaholic with few close friends and limited appetite for the social display that consumed so many of his neighbors on the avenue. He was not happily married. His wife Nanny eventually lived separately from him in France, where she died in 1896. His son Marshall Field Jr. built his own home right next door at 1919 South Prairie in 1884. Father and son, side by side on the most expensive street west of Fifth Avenue, and yet the private life behind those walls was marked, by most accounts, by emotional distance rather than warmth. Marshall Field Jr. died in November 1905 from a gunshot wound, the circumstances of which remain historically murky, with accounts ranging from accidental shooting to suicide. Less than 2 months before his father followed him to the grave in January 1906, at 71 years old, from pneumonia contracted after playing golf on New Year's Day. On the day of Marshall Field's funeral, every store along State Street closed. The Chicago Board of Trade suspended its afternoon trading session. An entire city paused to acknowledge the passing of the man who had, more than perhaps any other individual, shaped its commercial character. His philanthropic legacy was equally significant, even if it arrived somewhat reluctantly. Field donated the land on which the first buildings of the University of Chicago were constructed. He gave $1 million to endow the Natural History Museum that grew out of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Reportedly after initial resistance, telling the museum's organizers that he knew nothing about museums and had no interest in them, before being persuaded that the endowment would secure his lasting legacy. That museum, ultimately enriched further by an $8 million bequest in his will, became the Field Museum of Natural History. It still stands today in Grant Park, named after the man who arrived in Chicago with almost nothing in 1856. There is a particular kind of irony embedded in the story of Marshall Field, one that surfaces when you look closely at the gap between his commercial philosophy and his personal conduct. The man who told his clerks to give the lady what she wants was also the man who fired employees caught gambling or drinking off the job, who used informers within his own workforce to monitor fraternization with union officials, and who stood virtually alone among Chicago's major businessmen in opposing clemency for the defendants of the Haymarket affair, a position so firm that other men, who privately disagreed, admitted they were not willing to publicly contradict the most powerful businessman in the city. Field understood the customer. He was considerably less interested in the worker. That contradiction between the gleaming store windows on State Street and the conditions behind them, between the elegance of 1905 South Prairie Avenue and the wages paid to the women who worked the counters, runs like a fault line through the entire narrative of Chicago's Gilded Age. And no one on Prairie Avenue embodied that fault line more dramatically than Field's neighbor just a few doors down the avenue, a man who built his empire not on what people wore or bought or carried home in paper bags, but on what they ate. Let's talk about a man who built his fortune on the idea of a good night's sleep. George Mortimer Pullman arrived in Chicago in the 1850s with a trade learned from his father, moving large buildings. He was, quite literally, the man who helped lift Chicago out of the mud, contracting to raise entire city blocks on new foundations as the city installed its first sewer system. That work gave him enough capital to pursue an idea that had been forming in his mind for years. American railroad travel in the mid-19th century was miserable. Cars were dirty, cramped, and brutally uncomfortable for overnight journeys. Pullman believed that if you built a sleeping car that was genuinely luxurious, with fine upholstered berths, clean linens, proper ventilation, and the feel of a private hotel room on wheels, passengers would pay a premium for it. His first proper sleeping car was completed in 1864. The cars cost more than 5 times the price of a standard railway car, but they were unlike anything that had existed on American rails. When President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, Pullman arranged for one of his cars to carry Lincoln's body from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. an event witnessed by hundreds of thousands of Americans who lined the route in mourning and which gave the Pullman name a national prominence no advertisement could have purchased. By 1890, the Pullman Palace Car Company operated more than 2,000 railroad cars across approximately 160,000 miles of American track, with over 12,000 employees. The company held a virtual monopoly on the luxury sleeping car business. Pullman's Prairie Avenue mansion, completed in 1876 in the French Second Empire style, was a social anchor of Millionaires Row. He was received at the White House by President Grant, hired Robert Todd Lincoln as his personal lawyer, and was widely regarded as one of the grandest figures in American industrial life. And then he built his company town. In 1880, Pullman announced plans to construct a plant community on the shores of Lake Calumet, roughly 13 miles south of downtown Chicago. He hired the same architect who had designed his Prairie Avenue mansion to plan an entire self-contained town: brick row houses, parks, a hotel, a library, a church, shops, and a factory. Workers would live, sleep, shop, and worship within a community owned entirely by the Pullman Company. He called it a model of industrial paternalism. What critics noticed was the iron logic underneath. Rent was non-negotiable, prices in company stores were set by the company, and Pullman had guaranteed his investors a 6% return on their investment in the town, a promise that locked him into keeping rents fixed regardless of what happened to wages. What happened to wages in 1893 was catastrophic. A national financial panic triggered the worst economic depression the United States had yet experienced. Pullman cut wages by as much as 30%. He did not reduce rents. He did not reduce prices in company stores. A worker might earn $9 over 2 weeks, with $9 in rent taken directly from his paycheck, leaving him with 7 cents to feed his family. When workers sent a delegation to meet with Pullman personally, he had them fired. On May 11, 1894, the workers walked out. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, launched a national boycott. Union members refused to operate any train carrying Pullman cars. Within days, 125,000 workers on 29 railroads had joined. Rail traffic across the western United States was paralyzed. President Grover Cleveland sent 2,500 federal troops to Chicago over the objections of the Illinois governor. By late July, 30 people were dead, and the strike had been crushed. Debs went to prison, but Pullman never recovered his reputation. A government commission found his paternalism partly responsible for the disaster and described the operations of his company town as un-American. The Illinois Supreme Court eventually forced the company to sell off its residential properties. Pullman died in October 1897, just 3 years after the strike, at 66. His family, fearing that labor activists might desecrate his grave, had his coffin encased in concrete and steel at Graceland Cemetery. Half a mile from Pullman's mansion, Philip Armour was building something of an entirely different nature. Armour had accumulated his initial capital speculating on pork futures in Milwaukee while supplying provisions to Western gold miners. He understood early that Chicago, with its converging railroads and the newly opened Union stockyards, established on Christmas Day 1865, was going to become the center of the American meat industry. Armour and Company, formally organized in 1867, grew into the largest meatpacking operation in the world. What made Armour genuinely revolutionary was his obsession with eliminating waste. He famously declared that his operation used everything from a slaughtered animal except its last breath. Bones went to button and comb manufacturers. Stomach linings were processed into pepsin, a digestive aid. Fat became oleomargarine and soap. Hair was sold to brush makers. This philosophy simultaneously made him richer than almost anyone in Chicago and reduced some of the pollution the meatpacking industry had been depositing into the waterways of the South Side. The conditions inside his plants, however, were another matter. Workers, many of them recent immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Bohemia, labored in brutal circumstances. Workers who processed bones developed lung disease. Tanners developed open sores from chemicals applied without protection. Machine injuries were common. When workers organized for an 8-hour workday in 1886, Armour threatened to close his Chicago operations entirely. His ideological opposition to unions was absolute. He died in 1901, his fortune enduring in the institution that would eventually become the Illinois Institute of Technology. A few miles north, a different machine was transforming Chicago. Cyrus McCormick had invented his mechanical reaper in Virginia in 1831, but came to Chicago in 1847 to be closer to his customers, the farmers of the Midwestern prairies who needed a machine that could harvest wheat without armies of manual laborers. His North Side factory began mass-producing reapers on a scale that transformed American agriculture. By 1860, the McCormick Reaper Works produced more than 4,000 machines a year. Wheat plantings doubled in regions where the reaper was used. Illinois became the leading wheat-producing state in the country, and a strike at the McCormick plant on May 3, 1886, the day before the Haymarket Square bombing, set in motion one of the most consequential episodes in American labor history, drawing Chicago's industrial world into a crisis from which its reputation for labor conflict would never fully recover. The last of the great Prairie Avenue dynasties was, in many ways, the one that ended it. Bertha Palmer had actually preceded Marshall Field in Chicago retail, building a successful dry goods business that he eventually sold to Field and Levi later before turning to hotels and real estate. His rebuilt Palmer House, completed in 1873 after the original burned in the Great Fire, cost $13 million, featured 700 rooms, 85,000 square feet of marble flooring, and a barbershop floor inlaid with 800 silver dollars. But it was his wife, Bertha Palmer, who became the true social force of Chicago's Gilded Age. When the Palmers completed their permanent residence in 1885 on the newly developed Lake Shore Drive, a castle-like structure with 42 rooms each decorated in a different style, a 75-foot ballroom, and original paintings by Renoir, Monet, and Degas, the direction of Chicago's elite shifted permanently northward. Prairie Avenue had lost its most powerful social engine, and the rest of Millionaires Row could feel it. The families began to follow. By 1911, warehouses and light industry were pressing in on both sides of the avenue. The mansions that had defined an era were turned into boarding houses, demolished for factory space, or simply abandoned. The neighborhood that guidebooks had recommended as a tourist attraction during the 1893 World's Fair became, within a single generation, an industrial district. Of the nearly 90 mansions that once stood between 16th and 22nd Streets, only 11 survived to the end of the 20th century. The Glessner House, designed by Henry Hobson Richardson and completed in 1887, stands today as a museum and national historic landmark, one of the last physical witnesses to the world that Field, Pullman, Armour, McCormick, and Palmer built on the south side of Chicago in the decades after the fire. They came from farms and small towns. They arrived in a city that barely existed. They built an industrial civilization from the prairie upward, and when the neighborhood they had created no longer suited them, they left it behind. The workers who had made their fortunes stayed. The mansions fell, and Chicago kept moving forward, as it always has, indifferent to what the previous generation left behind. That is the story of the 5 most powerful families in Chicago during the industrial boom.